Fire Emblem! Engage!
Fire Emblem Engage was released almost as soon as I started Genealogy of the Holy War. I anticipated Engage to envelop most of my time, to capture my attention, while Holy War would be anchoring me down. I've played most localized Fire Emblems, and it is of my opinion that modern being Awakening and newer, emblems are inherently better. Anyone who cried otherwise I would always write off as resentful that their favorite series went mainstream, or that they were just being contrarian to seem cool. Now presented with two emblems on my plate simultaneously, surely old Emblem could not possibly compete for my affection. Shockingly though, it was Holy War sucking me in, and as of this recording, I've only touched Engage for 3 hours. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War is by far the best old emblem I have ever played. It is the ultimate Fire Emblem. I'm not sure I'd call it the best, but it's certainly the biggest, the grandest, and most importantly, the one that came closest to actually making me care about the plot. Normally, I just skip all the cutscenes because I hate them, and Fire Emblem as a series is made up of this political drama that you could not pay me to even begin to give a doodle about. I will spoil said plot of Genealogy of the Holy War, but before I do, I will leave you with this. If you have ever wanted to give any pre-Awakening Fire Emblem game a shot, make it this one. Okay, we ready? Despite my praise, the game starts with way too much backstory, way too quickly, half of which I can't even read. Yes, I am aware that I played the inferior older translation, probably just stopped about a dozen comments by mentioning that. Of course, in hindsight, all of this makes much more sense to me now, but your first time, it just drones on and on. You've got this entire calendar history of the Grand Kingdom, then an animated map about different towns and warlords, which goes into different characters directly speaking with one another. There's far too many names, there's far too many places to keep track of all at once. 13 minutes and 24 seconds after you power on the game is how long it takes to finally move your first units. And even then, we're not done talking. Which, if you're used to modern video games, isn't all that much, but it's a peeve of mine. Over 13 minutes of an exposition dump before your game even starts is a horrible way for specifically me to get invested. Give me something like Chrono Trigger where the game just starts anytime. I understand the desire to explain everything, but this intro cutscene embodies everything I typically hate about the stories in Fire Emblem. There's just way too much. There's far too many names, far too many locales, too many countries, way too many nouns to possibly take in all at once, especially when most of these names, even in hindsight, I will confidently say end up being bit players at best and really didn't need their whole life story spelled out to them in this way. You know what I took away from most of the first half of this storyline for like the entire game, not the opening cutscene? Fire Emblem's society, the fabric that binds their world together, is full of war-hungry, no-thought meatheads. Which, if your goal is to make a video game about war, well, I guess you got me there. It wouldn't be too much fun peacefully jaunting, marching from one map to another with nobody to fight. It's sort of like medieval Europe structurally, and that everything is divided into these small feudal territories loosely organized into different countries. No matter how small, no matter how shitty a particular castle is, they all jump in at a pin's notice attempting to conquer something or another. Sigurd, oh yeah, you're Sigurd, by the way. Sigurd's army will defeat the Lord of Castle A. Then Castle B, who has a baked-in, long-standing rivalry with Castle A, will see this, and instead of thinking to themselves, thank God Sigurd took care of those assholes, and abstaining from battle, it's always, oh, now's our chance with Castle A out of the way. Nobody will stop us from taking over. Like, you couldn't wait, I don't know, a week? So I'll go somewhere else before making your advance? These goobers like Gandalf, okay, are all out for blood. You're sort of stuck in the middle of this power vacuum. The current king of Grand Vale, or is it Grand Bell? All the dialogue says Vale, but the animated map clearly says Grand Bell. Anyway, the current king is murdered, you and your family are framed as the culprits, and the resulting power vacuum sees all these different factions vying for the throne. Along the way, Sigurd gets married and has a kid with this forest fairy girl. You go from region to region, being the stand-up guy you are, fighting in the name of the current order, ironically destabilizing most of the continent in the process. Your wife, the forest fairy Deirdre, gets kidnapped by some evil wizard, but Sigurd doesn't see it happen, so he thinks she just went missing or something. So you make your way back to the capital, then the big betrayal, or the BB as I like to call it, where Arvis, who is the brother of one of your units, and earlier he gave you a sick-ass sword, helps you fight off supposedly the guy who framed you, welcomes you back with open arms, then turns heel by revealing that your wife is royalty and is actually his wife now. Then he murders you along with your entire squad. The story then picks up 17 years later with the children of your original units. And at this point, it's Lion King. That's what it boils into. Sigurd's son is the rightful new king of Grandbell, not the kids Arvis, the perpetrator of the BB, had with the same woman. The whole second half of this game is Self's, Sigurd's kid, journey back into the homeland, righting the wrongs of the evil new king. I always thought that Awakening was the first entry to have romance and childbearing mechanics, but nope. That was all introduced here in Genealogy of the Holy War. How you use your units in the first half of the game directly affect which kids you get to use in the second half, and I'm aware that planning out, mixing and matching, crafting different specific builds is a huge part of this game for hardcore Fire Emblem super fans, but these mechanics are almost entirely in the background, hardly explained, and I did not go out of my way to interact with them whatsoever. I just kind of let the cards fall where they may. So if you would, please excuse my suboptimal, inferior children. It's not their fault, it's mine. After the BB, Arvis is the only one left standing to take power. He unites the entire game world under one empire, installing himself as an absolute monarch. He vows to fight for a land of equality, and according to Lewin, one of your units from the first half of the game who miraculously survived the BB, he actually does an okay job as emperor at first. Whenever we see enemies speaking amongst themselves, Arvis is always the moderate, fighting back against the extremist tendencies of his allies. They want to sacrifice children to revive some dark dragon god, and there's heavily implied human sexual trafficking happening. After Sigurd's wife is kidnapped, Arvis explains in a cutscene that when he found her, she was an amnesiac, which, if true, probably means that he wasn't the mastermind behind her kidnapping, and instead it was a plant by the cult leader. So he may not have even known. Juxtaposed to the awful backstabbing Arvis did to take over, he meant well. And the game does a great job of making him not the guy you want to hate, despite him being the guy who kills you. It's his stupid kid, Julius, that ruins everything. In order to get where he's got, Arvis aligns himself with this satanic cult, but he's strong enough to ward off their influence. His kid, born into this new status quo where his father's the emperor, sells out hard to these cultists. Then he undermines Arvis, becomes more powerful than his father because of this evil book the cult gives him. And the events that set all of this into motion is Sigurd's doing. And Sigurd was warned. When you first meet your wife, it is explained that she is, quote, forbidden from associating with men, and that, quote, a great catastrophe would befall if she ever did. The real evil of the entire planet is unleashed because of something that you did, and you were warned. I absolutely love shit like that. Aside from me actually caring enough to pay attention to the story, what sets Genealogy of the Holy War apart from other Fire Emblems and other tactical RPGs in general is its massive map size. Never before or since has a turn-based strategy RPG attempted to have maps as large as this one. In Fire Emblem 3 Mystery of the Emblem, the standard map size was 32 by 32 movement grid squares. Here in Genealogy of the Holy War, it's 64 by 64, which isn't twice as much, that's 4 times as much in Squarespace. And if you'd like a more modern comparison, then the largest maps get in 3 houses is 30 by 30. Oh yeah, and all the maps also fit together to form this one cohesive, nice game planet. I will say that these larger maps are a bit of a double-edged sword. It adds so much waiting. Old Fire Emblem games are already kind of a slog because you need to wait for your enemy to make their turn. Larger maps equals more enemies, and more enemies means more waiting. Waiting is already an inherent problem to these games, and it's magnified with this style. There's also much more post-skirmish maneuvering around than in any other Emblem. You take out one fleet of enemies, then your next encounter might be way over there, so you'll spend a dozen turns just moving your units all the way across the map. A trope which I do approve of, and where these giant areas shine, are when new, either neutral or playable characters appear on another section of the map, generally with enemies closing in on them, and your task is to move through your foes fast enough to get there on time to save them. We see this in Chapter 1 with playable units due in Eden, a thief and a white mage running from this squadron of bandits. Again in Chapter 2 with Lewin and Sylvia, a black mage and a dancer. In Chapter 3 with 3 different units on the northern continent, a sword fighter and black and white mages. Then when we get to Chapter 4, you're tasked with saving these kids. Same idea, except your reward is not a new character, it is experience points. At the start of Chapter 4, 3 of your units leave to enlist reinforcements. They come back in Chapter 5, and they're all the way across the map. Nothing we haven't seen before. We have now encountered this exact scenario in every map so far in this game. Only now, in Chapter 5, they pull the rug out from under us because it is impossible to get there on time. Not in a, I'm bad at video games kind of way. In a, they purposefully placed these units too far away that it is impossible to get there in time, for the sake of having a storyline death. It turns this technique that they've used on its head, and it makes these characters' deaths much more impactful. It gives you false hope, like you can maybe get over there and save them in time. Except, no. It's a wonderful example of a bait and switch of a game's story living through its game mechanic, and is needless to say much better than a 13-minute long cutscene that vomits out so much information all at once that it may as well have said nothing at all. The other massive, even massiver, possibly the massivest shockwave caused by having these big-ass maps. There are only 11 chapters, 12 of you include the introductory. These can each take upwards of 5 hours if you're cautious like me, so expecting players to do them in one sitting was unreasonable. As a result, you may now save at any time. Fucking yes, thank you very much. Fire Emblem 3. When I reviewed that, was a bit of a disaster because I ended up having to restart almost every single chapter multiple times, because if you didn't know, in old Emblem, when a character dies, they're dead forever. Not to mention completely fucking myself over against the final boss of Book 1, when I got myself into a situation where I could not even damage him. As a result, a likely 40, maybe 50-hour game took me over 70 to finish. Genealogy of the Holy War was not far behind in pure completion time, but that's because this game is actually stuffed with enough content to justify that length. Instead of redoing entire chapters, undoing roughly 40 minutes to an hour of progress each time, Holy War prompts you to save at the start of every turn, and I was making additional bookmark saves throughout each chapter. When a unit dies because I stupidly put them one square inside of a fuck you enemy's range, I can just reload my save from the last turn and try again. This alone saves me so much anguish. There are other mechanics either added or subtracted, I guess, to try and balance this new feature out. For starters, there are no healing items. You're either using your mage's staves or HP recovery squares, which most of the time you won't have access to, or winning a fight in the arena also restores your HP. The start of each area also has this deployment screen where you can take each individual unit to town, restore their weapons, which are now permanent, by the way. Nothing breaks forever anymore. Instead of sharing a single pool of money, each character now has their own gold supply, which sort of results in a rich getting richer sort of situation because there's no way to directly transfer gold, or items for that matter. The easiest way to make more money is to win fights at the arena, so it kind of just results in characters that don't need as much money because they're winning so much at the arena, just getting way too much, while characters that can't fight at the arena, such as your mages, are always struggling with money because, well, they can't easily win anymore. The only exception are thieves. Thieves can steal money off enemies on the battlefield and then give it to anyone, but thieves are horribly crippled as a class. They're almost useless in combat, and both of them died shortly after joining my team, so I never really ended up using them. Transferring items, even though there's no direct way to do it, is still technically possible. If you sell said item to the store, then you may buy it back with the desired character. But again, this is easier said than done because everyone has their own cash. Like if I pick up a staff with one of my fighters, you'd think I would just be able to give it to the mage, but it doesn't work that way. I don't know, it's really silly. Another change to battles is the need to constantly defend a home castle. Most of the time, it won't be under threat, but sometimes the game will send sneak attacks, where you either need to use a warp staff to get back, or reload a prior save so you can preemptively leave some of your units behind. As for the battles themselves, like when you're actually fighting, it's Fire Emblem. Turn-based strategy, good stuff. But I will say with these larger maps, it's hard for non-mounted units to keep up. Their movement range simply doesn't cut it in a large range of scenarios unless you're an overpowered super god like Jamek or Shannon. Two Hall of Fame Fire Emblem units for sure. Speaking of mounted units, they're a problem to fight against as well. Here's a common Fire Emblem situation. All of my tougher units are arranged in a line, forming a wall to protect my squishier characters. Being in a line, leaving no spaces means that in theory, unless you're on the end, only one enemy can engage you at a time. It's supposed to spread out the damage quasi-equally among everyone in the front line, ensuring that no one character takes too much damage and that everyone will survive. This does not work against horse-mounted units, because now, in this game, starting in this game, and continuing on in future games, they're able to move after attacking. Many a time, I would line all my characters up, the enemy would pinpoint one weak link, and the entire fleet would attack this single unit, killing them. Again, in this entry, it's not as big a deal because you can just reload and try a different formation, but going forward, like in Tharsia 776, I can tell this is going to get annoying fast. Speaking of Tharsia, that was probably my favorite area from this entire game. They're portrayed as this downtrodden, poor kingdom because it's this mountainous, non-farmable land, and in a medieval-style world economy, having farmable land is sort of the end-all be-all. But they're also the dragon tamers, and everyone wants them as an ally. When you're finally able to swoon one to your side, she becomes one of your most overpowered units. Then in the final battle, if you keep said unit alive, they join in on your side. They don't end up being that useful because they're allied units and they're stuck using the dumb computer AI, which basically just means that they get themselves killed by just fucking walking into enemies' ranges. Whatever, I digress. It's a neat little bone they throw you. Even though they're not that helpful, it's cool from a story perspective. The final boss is Arvis's son, Julius, but it's more of a gimmick than a traditional boss. Just gotta use the magic MacGuffin book on him. He dies, and then I can't even read the ending. Yeah, I know I fucked up. Next time I'll make sure I have the good translation. I'm not sure why Fire Emblem has never gone back. At least to my knowledge, they've never gone back. Why they've never tried using giant maps like this ever again. It's begging for the quality of life improvements modern Fire Emblems would give this. Nowadays, instead of watching enemy units move for minutes at a time, you just hit start and now it's your turn. A lot of people talk about remaking Genealogy: The Holy War, which I don't necessarily want, but I would love to see them return to this huge map style. Shout out to Lear Gamma, or Gamma Lear, the biggest Fire Emblem fan I know. Shout out to William Robert Lee. Shout out to the rest of the patrons. Breath of Fire 2 is the winner of the poll. The new poll is up. You can go vote on it now if you're on Patreon. I'm excited because Breath of Fire 2 was one of my favorite games. Spoiler for that video. Never trust anyone who needs a haircut. Good. Bye.
Look for the Gummy Bear album in stores on November 13th with lots of music, videos, and extras.